Good evening, then, officially to everyone. The title of this Bible study is Lessons from the Life of Joseph. And this is part four of the series that we're doing. I won't go all the way back to do a recap from the very beginning, but last time we left off after covering the time in which Joseph had been sold first to those Midianite or Ishmaelite traders and then taken down to Egypt and resold, if I could put it that way, as a slave to Potiphar, captain of the guard under Pharaoh. And that was actually quite a high position, as we covered last time. And Joseph was so adept, even though he'd been purchased as a slave, he was much more than a household servant. He was so adept at management and business that Potiphar had entrusted his entire household business. And again, that's more than simply managing things in a house, but I don't have time to recap all of that. This was a very responsible job under a person with a lot of authority in Egypt. And Joseph was doing that very, very well. Now, although he was a slave, we might say he had a relatively good life if you're going to be a slave under Potiphar. However, that ended when Potiphar's wife tried very hard to seduce the young man into an adulterous relationship, and he refused because he said, "How can I sin against God?" He knew what sin was, and he obviously had been taught by his father. And even though he had made some mistakes and may have had some arrogance there early in life in his teens, but he had learned about God and he had developed a real commitment. So the lady turns on him and then accuses him of attempting to assault her. At least that's what she told her husband. Potiphar becomes angry and he has Joseph imprisoned. And I was reading a little bit, I just want to follow up on what we closed with last time, life in an Egyptian prison. And I want to quote something from a source called the Associates for Biblical Research. It says, the biblical mention of Joseph serving time in a prison is noteworthy. To us, in modern times, serving time in a prison as punishment for a crime seems quite natural. And, we've all heard of that. We probably all know people who have been in prison for some reason or may even be in prison at the current time. Now, continuing the quote, but in the ancient world, this was not the case. The death penalty, a fine, or even bodily mutilation were the usual means of making people suffer for their crimes in the ancient Near East. And mutilation, you've heard of those things, still practiced a little bit in some corners of the world. Cut off your fingers, for example, for theft. As gruesome as that is, I suppose it would be quite a deterrent to crime. But prisons, as we know them, were, quote, rare in the ancient world. And yet Joseph finds himself imprisoned for a good part of 13 years. And the reason I say 13 years, we're going to find out where we began tonight. He's 30 years old. We know that he was sent down to Egypt, sent against his will, but was taken down to Egypt when he was 17. That's 13 years. The math is simple. I would like to know how many of the 13 years he was in Potiphar's house and how many of the 13 years he was in prison. I feel rather strongly the greater part of the 13 years was in prison, but I don't know. Wouldn't we like to know? It's funny, the Bible gives us some interesting tidbits, like even the size of the bed for one guy. Remember that? Was that Og? I forget. But we don't know how many of the 13 years Joseph was in Potiphar's house and how much of it was in prison. So, after a long 13 years of being a slave, and then a prisoner, Joseph's life is about to take a real dramatic turn once again. And that's what we're going to be covering this evening. Now, oddly, instead of going right to Genesis chapter 41, I'm first going to turn to First Peter 5 and verse 6. And I have a reason for doing that. I think it makes a good introduction to the study tonight. If you would turn with me to First Peter and the last chapter there, chapter 5. Peter is beginning to close his letter, and he begins to dwell on humility and submission and so forth. But I only want to read one verse, and that's verse 6. Verse 6, 1 Peter 5. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. I wonder if anyone lived that much more than Joseph, who truly did humble himself under the mighty hand of God. Now, for a part of that was forced upon him, and I understand that, but he remained humble before God. He never lost his faith. And then the last part of that verse, that you might be exalted in due time. But for him, the due time was pretty long. Now I want to go back to Genesis 41, and that's where we're going to resume the lessons, as I've called this, lessons from the life of Joseph. I'll try to go a little more quickly than I have in previous studies, but in the first verse, chapter 41 of Genesis, very first verse, it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the river. Now, a little background, if you've forgotten, we closed out chapter 40 with this account of Joseph being in prison and interpreting the dreams, in other words, revealing under God's inspiration the meaning of 2 dreams. And one was the dream of Pharaoh's butler, who had been thrown in prison. The other was the dream of Pharaoh's baker, who had been thrown in prison. And remember, he told them exactly what their dreams meant. The butler was going to be restored to his position in 3 days. The baker was going to be executed in 3 days. And that happened exactly under God's inspiration, as Joseph said it would. But he told the butler, he had such faith and confidence in God's revelation to him that he said, you know, when you're back there in Pharaoh, I'm just paraphrasing, when you're back there in Pharaoh's presence, you put in a good word for me. Because he said, I've been placed here unjustly, which is absolutely true. Well, what does he do? He's restored to his position, he, meaning the butler, but he does nothing to go to bat for Joseph. I'm just using the modern parlance. So Joseph lingers, you know, how long before you're exalted in due time? Lessons from the life of Joseph. There's so many here. So he lingers 2 more years in prison, and now here comes another dream. Now let's read a little bit about that. I'm going to go verses 2 through 7 and make a little bit of comment. Verse 2, this was Pharaoh's dream. Suddenly, there came up out of the river, and this is understood to be the river Nile, came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. And then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine looking and fat cows. And it says, so Pharaoh awoke. Now, he apparently awoke just for a short time, because verse 5 immediately continues, he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke second time, and indeed it was a dream. So this is a strange dream. Cows are not carnivores, in other words, meat eaters. This is a strange dream. Kernels of grain do not consume one another. So, what does all this mean? I also noted the east wind. I think in virtually trying to think who all is participating tonight, but I think in virtually every area, certainly where we live in the immediate environs here, an east wind quite often brings moisture, right? And this is kind of incidental, but an east wind in that region comes off the Arabian desert, especially a southeast wind, and it just dries up everything. So this is all accurate, except such a strange dream. Let's go on, verse 8. Now it came to pass in the morning. So this all happened in one night, in the morning, that his spirit was troubled. You know, his mind must be racing. And what does he do? He sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. And that was such a common practice. You know, you find that in the book of Daniel and other places in the Bible. That's what they would do. I don't have time to stop and comment much this time, but seeking for these magicians, wise men, to interpret it. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. No one among all of these folks could tell him what this dream meant. Now, they could have made something up, but I think this is, in this case, they're being honest, but it is all for a great purpose. God is behind this. They have no idea what it means. Verses 9 through 13. This is where we're going to see a dramatic turn in the life of Joseph, or this is what leads to it. Verse 9. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. He could just as well have said, I remember my sins. And he goes on, verse 10, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. So he's remembering, he's recalling this. This is more than 2 years ago when they were thrown in prison. Verse 11, he goes on, he said, we each had a dream in one night, or in the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation or the meaning of his own dream. Verse 12, now there was a young Hebrew man with us there. Very interesting. This is Joseph. Going on, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. In other words, he gave us the meaning of our own dreams. Verse 13, and it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me, or he could have said, you restored me to my office, and you hanged him. So he's rehearsing all of this. And of course, what he's really telling Pharaoh, I know a man who can probably interpret this dream. Now, verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. At last, he's been released in the most unusual circumstance here because Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the top ruler of the land, wants to know what his dream has meant, and he's been told this young Hebrew can do it. It says they brought him quickly. There was a lot of haste here. Pharaoh can't wait. Excuse me. But notice Joseph shaved and he changed his clothing. I'd like to comment just a little bit about that, if I may. I flip over my notes here. Here's something, again, from Ellicott's commentary on the Bible. The Egyptians were known in that time to be clean shaven. On Egyptian monuments from that era, only captives and men of low condition or low status are represented with beards. So Joseph can't go before Pharaoh looking like a captive, even though that's what he had been right up to this time, nor someone of low condition or status. He also changed his clothes. And I want to make a point there. He's coming before the king, the top man in Egypt. And there's a lesson there. We try to encourage people, even on the Sabbath day, the regular weekly Sabbath, when we come to our holy convocation called by God, we dress up, right? We are appearing before someone at his invitation to his holy convocation who is a million times greater in position than this Pharaoh was. And I just wanted to make a comment about that. Another lesson here from the life of Joseph. He follows protocol, and so should we. So now let's continue. Um, verse 15. Verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. And verse 16, Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And I want to stop there a moment. Pharaoh immediately says, I've heard of your ability to interpret dreams. But Joseph, with no hesitation, says, No, it's not in me. He sets him straight. He says, this will be of God. Now, that's quite a witness. In Egypt, there were countless gods, if any of you have studied that. Some of the craziest things, they primarily worshiped the sun, but they worshiped even the dung beetle. Remember some of those things if you studied that? But Joseph is defining God, singular. So he's placing that in the mind of Pharaoh, and he's really defending, if you will, his faith. Now, I want to read through the next verses, verse 17 beginning. We'll go quite a ways, clear down to, say, verse 24, and I'll make just a little bit of comment because much of this is rehearsing what we've read earlier. But in verse 17, Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream, I stood on the bank of the river. And then he says, these suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Verse 19, then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. And notice we didn't have this in the first part of the account that we read, but here he adds, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. He'd never seen worse looking cows than this. I have to make a comment here just because this happened to me recently. A friend of mine works in a sale barn up in Watertown, South Dakota, and he was telling me about some terrible, bony, lame cows that had been brought into the sale barn the previous week. He was describing them. He said they weren't even good enough for McDonald's. And I said, well, where did they go then? He said, dog food. I guess that happens. I don't know, but do you get the picture? That must be what Pharaoh was saying. These are barely good enough for dog food if it were modern times. But then he repeats, verse 20, and the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first seven, the fat cows. And when they had eaten them up, you'd think that would at least, even though that's very strange, they're not carnivores, but at least should have filled them. But he says, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. And then he said, I awoke. But then obviously he went back to sleep. Verse 22, also I saw in my dream, and suddenly seven heads came up on the stalk. And we've already read that. Full and good. Then behold, these seven heads withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprang up after them. And then he repeats what we've already read, those thin heads devoured the seven good heads. And then he said, I've already told this to the magicians. No one can explain it to me. Verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. In other words, they have a singular meaning. And then notice what he says again. He repeats this at least three times. This is the second time. He says, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Joseph is introducing Pharaoh to the great God, the God of all the universe. Verse 26 through 28. Now Joseph is speaking. The seven good cows are 7 years, and the seven good heads are 7 years. He said the dreams are one. In other words, they have a singular meaning. Verse 27, and the seven thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the seven empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. So he's talking about two time periods, each of them being 7 years. And in verse 28, once again, notice what he says. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. This is what I've told you. And then he says, third time, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. He wants him to know, I am speaking for God. God is revealing this to you. And I'm just so inspired by this. After everything Joseph had been through, he is still loyal to God, God Almighty. And he's really been humbled here. So let's continue verses 29 through 32. Joseph says, indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will come, or will arise rather, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. And how bad will it be? Well, in verse 31, he says, so the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. In other words, all those wonderful years, 7 wonderful years, are just going to be completely forgotten because of the 7 years following with famine. Again, very severe. Verse 32, and the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God. Here's the fourth time. The thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So once again, he's emphasizing this is of God. I find also these two pairs of sevens. I'll just digress here a little bit. This isn't necessarily a lesson from Joseph's life, but we see this so often in the Bible. Things being done, being made, and so forth in sevens. 7 days in the week, right? Established at creation, 7 days in the week, culminating in the Sabbath. 7 days of unleavened bread. 7 years, with the seventh year being a year of release. We don't read about that so much, but then there's 7 cycles. Remember? Seven times seven, the 49th year, and then the 50th year. After seven sevens, you have a year of Jubilee. Seven lamps on the lampstand in the tabernacle. Seven holy days or high days in the year. Seven churches in Revelation. Seven seals in Revelation. Seven trumpets in Revelation. Seven last plagues. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And here we have two cycles of seven. So again, God does things in his time and in his way. And seven is a very interesting number in the Bible, but I need to move on. Let's go to verse 33. There's quite a shift here. But first, I'm going to read verses 33 through 36 and then make some comments. Verse 33, now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers or overseers over the land. Why? To collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land in the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So he shifts, and I think this is a very interesting shift. He shifts from being the interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams and how he to now being an advisor on how he should prepare. Now he wasn't asked for this, but God moves him to do this. I have no doubt about that. Joseph is an articulate man, and he moves right on from here's what your dream means, and this is what you should do, sir. He's a real counselor at this point. Now, as I was reading this and rereading and studying and preparing, it did cross my mind, well, is he wanting to set himself up as the man to do this? I want to read a couple of things from commentaries. First of all, from Barnes' notes, it has an insightful comment about Joseph in this setting. Quote, openness of heart and readiness of speech now stand him, that is Joseph, in good stead. His thorough self-command arises from spontaneously throwing himself with all his heart into the great national emergency which is before his mind. And his simplicity of heart, practical good sense, break forth into unasked counsel. He is intelligent, capable of understanding the occasion, wise, and prudent. Was Joseph trying to advance himself? Now, this is a comment from a different commentary. This is from the Benson commentary. It says, this is inconsistent with his character. Joseph, in giving this counsel, could have no view to his own advancement to this office, as anything of that kind at that time when he was just brought out of prison would not have been in his mind. Gill's exposition on the Bible, and I'm following my own rules. Some of you who've heard me speak for a long time know I'm somewhat wary of commentaries. And so I follow the rule of the Bible. You establish every word at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, so I try to find 2 or more sources with some continuity. And that's what I found. Gill's exposition on the Bible agrees. This is what Gill's exposition says, quote, it can scarcely be thought consistent with the great modesty of Joseph that he means himself. So I did find that insightful. You remember where we started the study. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you in due time. Now, here's another lesson from the life of Joseph. He's just a very wise man, and he's telling Pharaoh, I think this is what you'd better do. Let's continue. In verse 37, and surely now God is really working something out here. Verse 37, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. So apparently it's not a private audience here between Pharaoh and Joseph, his servants. And I think it's more, these are probably officers in his government. They're hearing this. Let's go on to verse 38. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? So Pharaoh's getting something here. Now, I don't think he by any means completely understands the majesty of the great God of the universe that you and I know, but he has certainly through Joseph come to see there's a great God inspiring this man. Let's read verse 39 through 41. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. This is astounding. The man was in prison the night before. Lessons from the life of Joseph. The more I read this, the more astounded I am at how God is working things out here. Continuing verse 40, only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Now, he's going to remain supreme in authority in Egypt, but not much higher than Joseph. Joseph is going to be right there under him. Verse 41, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. You know, do we get the impact of this? You're a prisoner right up till what? I don't know, 6 a.m.? And before the day is out, maybe before the morning is out, whatever time it took to clean up and shave and maybe get a haircut and get good clothes on. And all of a sudden, after this relatively short conversation, the interpretation of the dream, Pharaoh makes this decision. This is just foreign to us. You know, this is a dictator. He can do these things. Those of us in the United States, you know that old saying, it would take an act of Congress. Well, I just can't see this happening. We'd be haggling, you know, the Congress or whoever would have to approve this. We'd be haggling for months. Probably wouldn't happen. But I better keep going here. This sudden change in the fortunes of Joseph. Verse 44, or I'm sorry, 42, verse 42. This expands on what Joseph's authority is going to be. Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. I'll stop there a moment. I don't have time to comment on every phrase here, but the signet ring. Have you ever studied that? Any of you? It's fascinating. Anciently, when you were given a signet ring, that was a symbol of authority. In other words, he had authority from Pharaoh to, the ring could be used to, it was engraved, they could stamp things in clay, which was then hardened, which would seal documents and so forth. He is giving him authority to make decisions. That is, Pharaoh, is giving Joseph authority to make decisions that are bound by Pharaoh himself. Verse 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. You know, I think, have you ever seen these motorcades when our president travels? You know, the big black, I think it's a Cadillac now, but this big black limousine, and then right behind, well, Joseph would be in the limousine right behind in modern terms, right? This is amazing. Notice also that something is it's dangerous if you give someone authority who isn't ready for it. In verse oh well, let me continue verse 43. After riding in the second chariot, it says, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. They're going to, that is, Egyptians are going to bow their knees to Joseph. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. This verse 43 is, well, 42 and 43 is just astounding. Verse 44, Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. It just goes on in these short verses, the authority that is given to this young man. But he was ready. He was ready. He had humbled himself under the mighty hand of God, and now he's being exalted in due time, and he doesn't abuse it. He does exactly what a good man of God could and should do. Verse 45, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Now, I don't think, obviously, that didn't all happen in a day, but he's gone from prison to having authority to go throughout the land of Egypt and make some awfully big decisions. I tried to look up this name. That was very common. Matter of fact, you read about that in Daniel. Remember, Daniel was given a name under Nebuchadnezzar, Belteshazzar. These kings and rulers in times past would do that. But I couldn't find anything significant about this name. His wife, well, we don't know much about her, but I did find this. This may be of interest, and I again got this from a commentary, or actually, this is from an article in his Associates for Biblical Research. The gift of a wife who is obviously a pagan, being the daughter of the priest of On, it shows that Joseph was being highly favored since priests at the time were at the pinnacle of Egyptian society. So he's being given or gifted, if I could put it that way, a wife. Again, that's certainly different from modern culture, but he's been given a wife now who's, shall we say, from the upper echelon, fitting for a man such as Joseph. The priest of On is also noteworthy since On was the center of worship of the sun god, Ra, or Re. But we could assume, and this is coming from this article, we could assume Joseph taught her the worship of the true God, but nothing is said. So I'll simply go on. Verse 46. I've been throwing around the number 30 before. Well, here's where I'm getting it. In verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. So it repeats. He's now he's got authority anywhere he goes within that land, that entire nation. I won't comment too much about the age of 30, but you know, it says Christ began his ministry, if you remember that, being about 30 years old. David became king over Judah when he was 30 years old. There's a little bit of a pattern there, too, in the Bible. But let me hurry on. Verse 47, he gets to work. Now, in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he, Joseph, gathered, or I think it might be better translated, he caused all the food to be gathered of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, plural. I presume this was done in many locations in the cities of the land, and that makes perfect sense. Continuing, he laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. So this was done locally. Remember, uh, Joseph is in charge, but he had advised Pharaoh, to appoint officers, which we read back in verse 34, over the land. So no doubt Joseph is doing that. He's got people working under him. This is being carried out. Verse 49, Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. They apparently were keeping records of the storage at the beginning, and then finally they just stopped. They couldn't measure it all. Very, very interesting story here. The 7 years and all the grain. I'm going to stop here a moment and just mention that I was also doing some research. I'm trying to figure out how they stored this. And I found two different sources that mention archaeological finds of silos found in Egypt, and they're calling them silos. They were made out of mud brick. They were round, 18 to 22 feet in diameter, and likely they can determine the diameter. That still exists, but none of them are intact as far as height. But it said likely 25 feet tall or perhaps more. So that is a sizable silo, if you will, for grain storage or granary. And in that dry climate, especially using mud brick, which wouldn't quickly absorb or give off moisture, I think it would be very good storage. I didn't have time to put together slides for this evening's study, but I hope I'm giving you a mental picture. That is likely how the grain was stored. Now let's continue. Verse 50. The story shifts to something else. A great blessing for Joseph. Verse 50. And to Joseph were born two sons before the years of famine came. So within that first 7 years, Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore two sons to him. Verse 51, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And Manasseh actually means making forgetful or being able to forget. So he's so happy. He's forgotten all the hard years that he had. And when it says he forgot all my father's house, well, he hadn't forgotten about his family, but he has forgotten, what was done to him, what his brothers did to him. That's the real meaning behind this. He's now triumphant, if you will. Verse 52, in the name of the second, he called Ephraim. Ephraim means fruitful. For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And it had been a land of affliction for him, certainly for 13 years, but now he's still in Egypt. But how his fortunes have changed. Verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands. Note that, all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So initially, Egypt is still doing okay. Verse 55. So in all the land of Egypt was famished. So it begins to impact them as well. The people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, or yes, Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. So this verifies how high Joseph's position was in Egypt. Pharaoh just said, go to him. Whatever he says, you do it. Verse 56, the famine was over all the face of the earth. So now we see it goes way beyond Egypt. And of course, that's going to play into the story here shortly. Continuing, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries, now once again, we see this extends way beyond Egypt. All countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. If I have time at the end, I'm going to expand on that a little bit. Let's quickly jump into chapter 42. I'd really like to cover part of chapter 42 tonight. When Jacob saw, now we're back up in Canaan, his father, Jacob. When he saw, or it would probably be better rendered, when he heard that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look at one another? Now they're stressed. Why are you just sitting around looking at one another? Verse 2, he said, indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die. So it's becoming very, very serious up there in Canaan. So, verse 3, Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. Now he's very, what shall I say, protective of this youngest boy, Joseph's only full brother. He does not allow Benjamin to go with them, but the older 10 head down to Egypt. Verse 5, the sons of Israel, or the sons of Jacob, went to buy grain among those who journeyed. So there are other people up there in Canaan who are heading down to Egypt. And then that verse ends, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Verse 6 is very interesting. This begins a fairly lengthy account of these 10 brothers of Joseph coming into contact with him after all these years. How long has it been? Well, 13. 13 years from the time he went down as first a slave, then a prisoner. Then we add 7 more. They've already had 7 more good years. So the math is simple. It's now 20 years, maybe getting into the 21st year. So, verse 6, now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. He's completely in charge of this distribution of grain. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them. It's been 20 years, maybe 21. We don't know for sure. 20 or a little more years, but he immediately recognizes his brothers. But, verse 7, second part of the sentence there, but he acted as a stranger to them, and he spoke roughly, or he spoke harshly to them. Then he said to them, where do you come from? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. Verse 8, it's repeated. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. I'm sure by all outward appearances, Joseph looks like an Egyptian. Not in heart and mind, but the way he appeared. And that's easy to understand. I don't have time to turn there, but if you remember, this would be a good long time later, but when Moses had to flee Egypt after he had killed the Egyptian, if you remember, he flees and he goes and he ends up by a well, and Jethro's, the priest of Midian's daughters, came out with their sheep to water them. And not Joseph, Moses steps in, waters, actually defends them a little bit, and then provides water for their sheep. And they go home, and their father, if you want to verify this, it's a very interesting story. Their father says, "Why have you come back so early?" And they said, "An Egyptian helped us." Remember that story? Well, Moses was of the tribe of Levi, an Israelite, but he's been raised in Pharaoh's court. This is years and years and years later, but he too looked like an Egyptian. So I'm sure it's the same here. They have no idea who Joseph is. Verse 9. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them, and he said to them, let's pause a moment. What's he remembering? Remember those sheaves? He said, my sheaves stood up and your sheaves bowed down to me. And of course, that really angered them. That didn't buy him any favor. Probably one of the mistakes Joseph made. He could have kept that to himself, but and then remember the sun, moon, and 11 stars, and they all bowed down to me. Oh, even his father questioned that and chided him for saying that. But now Joseph remembers. Now let's continue. Middle of that verse, he said, you are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land. King James, that's not the way we would put it today. Some translations will say, you have come to see the undefended parts of our land, or the unprotected parts of our land. And verse 10, they said to him, no, my Lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. Well, that's partly true. They weren't spies. They weren't very honest. Years and years earlier, when they stripped Joseph of that beautiful coat and then killed a goat, soaked the coat in the blood of the goat, and took it back to their father. And of course, that led him to believe a beast had torn Joseph apart. I'm not saying they were dishonest all of the time, but it is interesting what they said were honest men. Well, they hadn't been at all times. But let's continue. Verse 12, he said to them, no, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And I already commented about what that means. And verse 13, they keep pleading. They said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And in fact, the younger is with our father today, and one is no more. They don't realize they're standing in front of the brother who they presume is either dead or he's no more. They have no idea what happened to him. Joseph said to them, verse 14, it is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. So he's being harsh. And I don't know how you see this, but he's teaching them a lesson. He has authority to do this. You know, is this vengeance? And I thought about this as I was preparing. I don't think so. They needed to learn something. And Joseph is being harsh, granted, but sometimes that's the only way people learn. So let's continue. Verse 14, Joseph said to them, it is as I spoke to you, saying, you are spies. In this manner you shall be tested. I'm going to test you. This is how I'm going to do it. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, one of you go back and let him bring your brothers, and you shall be kept in prison, that your words may be tested to see whether there is any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. And notice what he did. Verse 17, he put them all together in prison 3 days. So he ramps up the stress on his brothers at this point, has them locked up for 3 days, and no doubt they're pretty fearful what is coming next. Joseph changes the plan a little bit. Verse 18. Then Joseph said to them the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. Now, he's not even speaking in their native language. We'll see that later. But he is, again, he's talking about God. I fear God. I don't know what that meant to them, but he's professing his faith here. Verse 19. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison house, but you, in other words, 9 of you then, go and carry grain for the famine of your houses. They're starving up there. Go back. You can carry the grain back. Verse 20, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you shall not die. And they did so. In other words, they chose one, it appears. Let me quickly go on. Verse 21, then they said to one another, we are truly guilty concerning our brother. You know, that's still in their minds too, or if it wasn't, it is now. It's all coming back to them. Uh-oh, 20, maybe 21 years ago, we did something bad. Notice verse, well, let me just continue this verse 21. For we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us. And there's a lot in this verse, and we would not hear. He must have been saying, no, don't do this, don't do this. Let me go back to dad. I don't know what he said, but think about this. And they just ignored him. Into the verse, therefore, this distress has come upon us. Now we're the ones crying out for mercy. Verse 22, Reuben answered them. He said, did I not speak to you, saying, do not sin against the boy? And you would not listen. Now that's true. Reuben did try to intervene for Joseph back at that time, but he didn't prevail. Continuing, therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. Verse 23, but they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. He obviously had learned the ancient Aramaic, the language of Egypt there, which he was using, and then having an interpreter, which he didn't need. But this is all for a purpose. An interpreter then was repeating it to them in their language, but he understands everything they're saying. In verse 24, it becomes very emotional for him, and he turned himself away from them, and he cries. He wept. Then he returned to them again, and he talked with them. And he took Simon from them and bound him before their eyes. Now, I'm sure that made an impression. I'm sorry, I said Simon, Simeon. Remember the birth order? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Simeon is the second brother. And either they chose him as the one or Joseph made the decision. And when they, whatever they did, handcuffed him or bowed him right in front of them all, I'm sure that put more fear into all of them. I'm going to choose to stop there this evening, but I want to read a little bit from a supplement before I break off from the Bible study this evening. I can see most of you because I'm using a gallery view. How many of you went back to our Beyond Today Bible commentary and read the commentary on this chapter? I'm just curious. Chapters 41 and 42. I found our commentary quite interesting about this. And what I wanted to pass on to you, and you can find this, archaeological finds have verified a lot about this period of famine. And I'll just quote a little bit. They found an inscription in what is southern Saudi Arabia today. It was on a marble tablet in a ruined fortress in present day uh, democratic Yemen. The inscription was translated, and this is a translation of this ancient inscription. And I don't have time to read it all, but here are some phrases. We dwelt in this castle 7 years of good life. How difficult for memory its description, because it happened just as Joseph said. They almost forgot all those good years because the next ones were so bad. I want to continue a quote as this was translated. Then came years barren and burnt up. When one evil year had passed away, then came another to succeed it. We became as though we had never seen a glimpse of good. That's how severe, and this is a record outside of the Bible, which verifies how bad that those 7 lean or bad years were. You and I believe the Bible. We absolutely have faith that this is God's word, but it's very interesting to find archaeological finds which also verify this. Here's a second one. Explorers in the last century discovered a number of other fascinating ancient inscriptions in the Middle East that provide confirmation of facts recorded in the sacred scriptures. And this has to do with this matter of these horrendous drought and famine. They found an engraved stone tablet found in the tomb of a rich Yemenite noblewoman of the patriarchal age. And it had her final inscription, and it confirms the account. I want to read just a little bit of it. I, Taja, the daughter of Zu Shafar. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but notice the next phrase. Sent my steward to Joseph, and he, delaying to return to me, I sent my handmaid. So she sent multiple people up, but she names, sent, first of all, my steward to Joseph. And I don't have time to read all of this because I know that I need to be wrapping up here. The 1 hour that we try to devote to these studies is all but over. Now, what is interesting to all lands? You know what we read, how widespread this was? I looked this up, and probably, assuming I've got these locations, she was down in what they just still Yemen today. Well, actually, it wasn't known as Yemen then, but this is down where the tablet was found in modern Yemen, going up to where Joseph was likely headquartered, would have been the capital at that time, known as Luxor in Egypt today. It is about 1,540 miles, over 1,500 miles. So you can see how widespread this was. So I want to rehearse the discussion topics before I stop the recording. We know that Joseph was first a slave and then a prisoner for 13 years. How would you cope in the same circumstances? I'm wondering what your thoughts are. How would you endure 13 years as he did? Second question. Joseph was suddenly freed and thrust into a very high position in the government of Egypt. How was he able to assume this role and perform so well as he did? Number three, can you see a parallel from the experience of Joseph being freed from servitude and being given great responsibility to the plan of God for every Christian? Is there a parallel there? Being freed from slavery and imprisonment to a great responsibility in the plan of God, again, for every true Christian. So I will cut off the recording And to those who may listen to this later, I hope it's profitable to you and thank you for listening and watching.